Today, we are going to find out what the state of the Metroid series is by looking at its history, looking at its present, and maybe finding a glimpse of its future. Starting off with the NES version of Metroid, the very first Metroid game. It's very difficult to see why people enjoy this game. To be very blunt, it is so difficult for me to see how anyone can enjoy most of the NES games. The only NES game that I personally would maybe play like once a year if I was interested is Super Mario Bros. And that is the only game in which I would even think about playing, because this Metroid game is very difficult to play, but it was the very first game in the series and has a very special place in a lot of people's hearts. Very similarly to a bunch of other NES games that Nintendo were putting out at the time, most notably The Legend of Zelda, this game is very big. It is very open, and you can get all kinds of items in different areas before moving on to other things, and similarly to the Metroidvania series at large, you could totally miss an entire area or a bunch of different items, and you would just never know about it. You could reach the credits without knowing about entire areas of the game. Just like every other NES game at the time, one of the biggest critiques for people in the modern day, and even back then, was just the movement system. So many NES games and SNES games, and just that older era of gaming, comes from the arcade style of games, to where they tried to make games a little bit too difficult, so that way you could replay it over and over again and want to put your money back into the arcade system. So with that in mind, Nintendo really didn't know how to make a game quite yet for just people having fun, for people not looking to die over and over again, and for people who were just going to sit down and play with their games. They didn't have to worry about the idea of just putting money back into the Donkey Kong arcade game. They bought the game and that was their game to play. So this type of development philosophy was still stuck in their heads at this time. This game is also extremely difficult because of that. They made the game a little bit too hard because that was just what they knew at the time. There weren't other types of games and other genres on other platforms to look at. They pretty much just made whatever they thought they wanted to make. And so what they had thought at that time was really being influenced by the arcade style of games, which then resulted in difficult NES games and somewhat difficult SNES games moving forward. But they obviously ended up figuring it out as the years went on, and Nintendo became known for their feel in their games and how much fun they are, and for a lot of people, how easy they can be at times. Now, compared to something like Mario or Zelda, where they don't have a ton of different abilities that you can use in those games, like with Mario, pretty much the Fire Flower is all you can do in that game, but in this game, they introduce a staggering amount of abilities and upgrades and power-ups to which Metroid ended up using the rest of its series history. Starting with the beam attack, which basically just fires basic projectile weapons, the jump, the crouch, which you can kind of like shorten your hitbox with, you can press down after acquiring the morph ball and roll through different spaces, you can use missiles to open red doors and defeat big enemies, bombs can help reveal hidden passageways, which a lot of people really had struggles with finding those places, long beams, ice beam, wave beam, the various suit, the high jump boots, the screw attack, energy tanks, all kinds of stuff that we continue to see in the series today. They really have not changed as much as you might think they have. Looking at Metroid Dread specifically, pretty much every single ability I just mentioned is in that game, if not more. They added more over time, sure, and things are a little bit more complex overall, but really, they haven't changed too much. The bones are very similar. Now, we will always have to pay our respects to the very first time a series that is beloved by all actually had its first game. And this game, it may be clunky, it may be difficult to play, I may never ever want to touch it again after the first time I did, maybe like 6 years ago, but it is still the very first game, and it is the reason that any other game after it came. And why the Metroidvania series is so popular today literally has to do with Metroid being its own thing and existing back when it did. The second Metroid game ever was called, can you guess? Metroid 2. Yeah, Metroid 2, Roman numerals 2, Return of Samus on the Game Boy. Now, this was the very first Metroid game for a handheld console ever. The Game Boy was extremely popular, as many of you probably know if you are watching this video, and obviously Samus goes back to eradicate more Metroids on her home planet. Now, the players have to go through, find and exterminate all of the different Metroids in every single area, and this game introduced the idea of being able to scan to find all the Metroids and destroy them and just be able to get rid of all of the different Metroids on the planet as much as she possibly could, which obviously, if you know by playing some of the more recent games, she did not eradicate every single one of them. This game was not entirely well received from what I could find in my research. It seemed to be fine, but a lot of people really thought the NES game was just so much better, and I can understand that perspective, especially looking back at games before the NES like Pong and all of these crazy things that just did not seem to be fun at all. For the NES coming out at its time, that game and those types of games had to have been a revolution for every single person who was ever interested in the idea of video games. So then for them to take that on a home console that was pretty much the most powerful thing on the market at the time, and then put it on a handheld in the Game Boy, which already didn't have the best reception because you couldn't see it too well on the screen. They ended up including a light later on with the Game Boy, but this black and white graphical style, as well as all of the other different types of movement changes from the NES to this version that didn't seem to make it that much better. All in all, people did not like this game as much as the NES game. Now let's move on to a game that a lot more people find to be more appealing in the modern day, and people will still go back to play even now. But before we do that, make sure you like and subscribe today's video if you've enjoyed the State of Metroid series so far. Thank you so much for considering pressing all those buttons. It really helps the channel out a lot, and consider joining my membership program if you want to have early access to all videos, including this one. Thank you so much. Back to the video. The SNES brought forth a lot of changes to the series and to the console at large, obviously. They doubled the amount of bits that you could play in from 8-bit to 16-bit, and now things look and play a lot better. The animations are so much better. The world looks so more alive, and the atmosphere just feels almost choking. It feels like it is choking you with this crazy space atmosphere. It feels so much more real to me. In this game, the map system is finally introduced, allowing the players to be able to track where the heck they've been, which obviously is something the NES couldn't have bothered to do. You would just get totally lost in that game, and if you didn't have it memorized or had a personal guide like in actual paper in your hands, which is what a lot of NES games had, was just physical guides that you had to buy if you ever wanted to even try to beat the game. This game finally has one in the actual UI. You can actually look at a map within the game itself. The game actually refined a lot of the controls from the first game. You have all the same abilities and weapons, but now you have directional aiming, which means that you can go forward and backward, but now it's kind of like also diagonal. You can lock on to different things. You can wall jump, which, by the way, you can wall jump, but it's one of the most ridiculously hard things you will ever try to do in this game is wall jump. And once I made it to one specific point in this game, I didn't even know you could wall jump, and as I tried to do it, it just simply wouldn't work. To the point where I had to actually look up what in the world I was supposed to do in that specific spot, and it was actually to wall jump. I was right. I knew I had to wall jump, but I didn't even know it wasn't a part of some sort of ability. You could do it from the very start of the game. It's just that the button press has to be so precise, and for you to get it multiple times in a row like the game actually expects you to do feels almost impossible. It feels so unfun, so un-Nintendo, and I'm glad that they have evolved from those days. Other things that they added in were the moonwalk, which means you could walk backwards and charge the beam as just some sort of optional mechanic. You didn't have to do it, but it was just fun to be able to do it and not have to worry about just pointing in the exact direction that you want to be in, even if you're walking backwards. Then there's the mid-air morph ball, which allows Samus to enter the morph ball form while she's jumping, which adds just more movement flexibility overall. This is a cool one. Super Metroid allows you to stack all of the different beam abilities together. You can combine the wave, the ice, and the plasma beams for one huge, powerful shot, which plasma beams are another thing that they added along with the, I think it's pronounced Spazer or Spazzer beam, and you have way more powerful and unique beam effects. That just goes along with the animations and stuff I talked about earlier. The SNES graphical updates are huge, and I cannot understate that. More stuff they added that ended up being series staples were super missiles, power bombs, grappling beam, which, oh yes, a grappling beam or a grappling hook in any game is just so amazing. The speed boost and then the X-ray scope were also other things that they added. They kept allowing you to upgrade your suits, the various suits or the gravity suits. Then it just featured more bigger and complex bosses. The Mother Brain fight has a second phase now, which was super shocking to people at the time who played the first game, did the Super Metroid, from Metroid to Super Metroid, and they played the Mother Brain, and boom! It just had a second phase. There was Ridley, Kraid, all of these other dudes that come back in the series and are just super iconic. The Zelda series is one that Nintendo always likes to say is like their story-driven series, but I would honestly argue that Metroid has more story than a lot of Zelda games do. You look at Skyward Sword, for example, that is pretty much all text box. Twilight Princess has a lot of text boxes as well that tell great stories. Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom does amazing jobs at like using their world around you to tell the story, but in terms of like traditional gaming storytelling, sure, Metroid doesn't have a ton of cutscenes and all that, but this game does introduce the idea of just this game being so much more cinematic. The series feels stylish, and this started with Super Metroid, and that is because you open up the screen and it pans through all these different places, and then it pans towards the Metroid, and then just the title screen music is so ominous. And then once you actually press start and you get to go to the game, one of the first things that you actually see is a cutscene of Samus with a bunch of really cool dialogue that just tells the story with actual background pictures and movement, and that is something the NES did not do at all. It was pretty much just standing still and then text, and that was how you figured things out, and sometimes you wouldn't even get that. And Super Metroid is when the series became iconic for its music. Iconic for its music. This game's music does not miss. There is not a single track in Super Metroid that does not slap. I love Super Metroid soundtrack, and that continued to be a trend throughout the series moving forward. This game truly doubled down on everything the NES version made good in the first Metroid game, and they just refined it. They continued to develop on top of the blocks that game started, and this game just kept adding and adding, and now we can understand a little bit more why the next games were so good. Now, here's the thing. Super Metroid came out about 8 years after the first Metroid game on the NES. Then obviously the Game Boy version came out in 1991, 3 years before Super Metroid, and 5 years after the NES Metroid. Now, if you are a big Nintendo historian and you know a lot about the company, the consoles, the history of this entire brand, then you probably are wondering, why did it take so long for them to get these games out? It seems as though the Metroid games almost come out at the very end of every single Nintendo console's lifespan. Well, the Metroid franchise ended up being a little bit later than a lot of the other ones. Zelda and Mario obviously came first and came early for a lot of these consoles. Those were the games of priority. Metroid was a different type of series that people did resonate with on the NES, but it wasn't even close to the success of some of their bigger NES titles. I mean, Super Mario Bros. Ended up selling 58 million copies worldwide. 58 million, compared to Metroid selling 2.73 million on the NES. Sure, Mario is very, very difficult to compare to a series like Metroid, but it makes sense now with this context as to why Metroid has always seemed to be on the back burner. But it's okay because Nintendo always seems to give their smaller series love, and they are okay with modest successes. They are okay with putting out games and they just don't blow everyone's socks off, but they sell a decent amount, and they continue to produce those games because those fan bases are really, really passionate about those series. But the problem came when Metroid sold 2.73 million units on the NES, and they thought, hey, we've got a decent seller here. Then the Game Boy Metroid II came out, Return of Samus. That game sold 1.72 million. And then the beloved SNES Super Metroid, which people talk about more than any other game to this day in the series, 1.42 million copies. Now, I am not at all saying that sales numbers equate to the idea of a series being good. This series is phenomenal, but it makes sense business-wise why Nintendo doesn't seem to care as much about pumping out these games, and why they seem to always come out closer to the middle or the end of a console's lifespan. The SNES ended up pretty much dying the second the N64 hit the market with its 3D graphics in 1996, so it really only had about a year and a half on the market. Because Nintendo was really happy with their handheld success, they wanted to continue to make games for those types of consoles as well, not just focusing every single bit of their development power on their big home consoles. They kind of started their divide around this SNES, NES era, where the home console and then the handheld console, and they were different and separate, and the handheld market really kept Nintendo alive, especially in the later years around the Wii U era. But before we get there, let's go back to the GBA 2002, because 2002 ended up being a phenomenal year for Metroid. It is the most the series has ever sold in a singular year. On the GBA, they released Metroid Fusion, which sold about 1.6 million copies, which, not the best, not the worst. At that point, Nintendo had really established themselves in the video game market as a juggernaut, and they knew what series were popular, what franchises needed to be at the spotlight, and what franchises needed to take a little bit more time to just do what they needed to do well. Fusion continued to develop upon the series' roots, upon Super Metroid, Metroid 2, and it was a phenomenal 2D game that sold decently well. I appreciate this game, I love this game, but they didn't do a whole lot of gameplay changes. They had pretty much decided everything up to this point had been pretty good. So, instead of changing up the gameplay, they decided to make this the most story-driven Metroid thus far. Samus is infected by something called an X-parasite, which leads to her fusion suit, just getting all sorts of different stuff messed up with her biological side. And then it also introduced another guy named Adam, which is her ship, and that ends up becoming a huge part of the story, especially later on down the line in Metroid Dread. In this game, we saw wall jumps being a lot easier to do, ledge grabs were better, they had a bunch of different missiles mapped to dedicated buttons. It was just overall an upgrade in every single way, and I don't understand why more people don't see Fusion like they do Super Metroid. Of course, Super Metroid is phenomenal, but I feel Fusion is really right on that same tier. But the other Metroid game that released that year that really captivated a new generation, that took Metroid to a new level, that absolutely made it worth skipping the N64 generation of home consoles for this franchise, was Metroid Prime on the GameCube. And oh my goodness, this game is phenomenal. It is beautiful, and up until Metroid Dread much later, it was the highest selling game in the series, 2.84 million copies. And that was a record, obviously, like I said earlier, that was not reached for another 19 years. That tells you how wide of an appeal this game had for the franchise's standards. This game took every single thing that was good about Metroid in its 2D style, and they simply turned it into a 3D masterpiece. Samus is just so gorgeous in this game. The suit, all of the different environments, it looks phenomenal. So much so that later on in the series, they ended up remastering it and redoing all the assets, and it just looks so good. And that was my first version of playing the game, was Metroid Prime Remastered later on down the line, and that game is just phenomenal. I love Metroid Prime. Every single ability, pretty much from the 2D games, are here except in 3D. The music is phenomenal. The environments, the enemies, the bosses, the variety of just everything is so fantastic. And the idea of a 3D Metroidvania is so intriguing, and not a lot of other games have had the guts to do it, but this game does it so well. It did it so well that Retro Studios ended up making 2 more Prime games, combining it into a trilogy later on. Metroid Prime released in 2002 alongside Metroid Fusion. Both those games sold well, we talked about that earlier, but this ended up being a very dark era for Metroid right after the release of Prime. It was 2 years before the sequel to Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, released, alongside of Metroid Zero Mission and the classic NES series Metroid. Both those games sold under 1 million units each, and Metroid Prime 2 barely scraped over 1 million in sales. In 2005, we had Metroid Prime Pinball selling 200,000 copies. In 2006, Metroid Prime Hunters just over 1 million. In 2007, we got Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, which sold 1.4 million copies. Not bad, but still not at all close to the original sales of 2.8 million. Metroid Prime had that. And then they released a trilogy on the Wii, which a lot of people say to this day is the best way to play those games, with the Wii pointer controls, and that game only sold 400,000 copies. Then we had an extremely weird release. In 2010, Metroid Other M came out, sold 800,000 copies, better than Metroid Prime Trilogy, which is a travesty in my opinion, but that game came out and was just so different from every other Metroid game prior. Of course, the very original type of Metroid was just 2D in that graphical style of the 8-bit, 16-bit, all that stuff. Then it moved to 3D with Prime, and it was just a 3D version of the 2D games, and people loved those. Metroid Other M abandoned all of that. It abandoned all of that. The traditional 2D format, the first-person exploration, all of that. It was completely and totally abandoned for a weird third-person stiff environment that you could only walk around in such odd manners. The story was really, really bad. The characters were odd. There was no free aiming. You just auto-locked onto enemies. There was a dodge mechanic called Sense Move that made Samus like pretty much invincible, and she was just unfun to play as. It was an entirely different type of format than anyone had ever expected. Now, for someone who may not have played the Metroid series, let me help you out a little bit to understand what Nintendo did here and why I think the idea wasn't that bad, but the execution ended up being what the problem was. Imagine if the Zelda series stopped being about exploration and combat and story. Imagine if the entire plotline of a Zelda game was completely gone. There was no lore whatsoever. Every single world that you went to was pretty bland. It was super easy to beat enemies and almost wasn't even worth including any enemies. And every, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you were interrupted by weird inner dialogue from Link, even though he had never really spoken before. Yeah, that's kind of what Metroid Other M was. Samus in that game was trying to be a lot more developed as a character, and I do appreciate that, and I think the idea of taking a franchise, taking a series, putting it in a different direction in some sort of spin-off, that would be really cool for other series like Splatoon, for example. Imagine they had done some sort of spin-off for Splatoon where it wasn't entirely based around multiplayer and they did some weird single-player focused thing like the Side Order DLC or the Octo expansion. Imagine those were like entire games, fully developed platformers. Like that would be pretty cool. But at the same time, that's not why people love the series, and if they do it and do it wrong, oh man, does that make it entirely worse, especially considering this franchise has never been a good series in terms of sales numbers. They decided to go out on a limb, and the limb snapped and cracked, and they fell, and it hurt, and it just was weird, and I didn't know if anyone would ever care about Metroid ever again. No one really knew where the direction of the series was going, or if Nintendo would ever bring it back to what they had loved. Now, are you ready for this? Because things got much worse. Just when Metroid fans thought they had hit rock bottom, there was yet another floor beneath that. 6 years went by, and in 2016, we got our next announcement for a Metroid game, Metroid Prime Federation Force. Now, it used the Metroid Prime naming convention without actually ending up being a Metroid Prime game. Federation Force took Other M's ideas, said, I know, we didn't make it weird enough. We didn't do enough of the opposite of what we wanted, of what the fans wanted. We didn't mess it up enough. That's why no one bought it. And they made it worse. It was a multiplayer-focused spin-off game that did not have Samus in it, that did not have any story in it, that made the graphical design and art style totally and completely numbed down to a weird cartoonish chibi style, and similarly to a lot of other 3DS games at the time, they made it into a mission-based structure thing, so that way you could just kind of take it on the go and finish it in chunks and little bursts of playtime. And there was a blast ball mode, like a 3v3 soccer mode in our Metroid game. It wasn't even a Metroidvania by any stretch of the imagination. It was horrible. It was awful. And the sales numbers thankfully reflected that, because this was the worst by far selling game in the Metroid series. 100,000 copies is all this game sold. Thank the Lord. This game was horrible, and it made the series a complete and total laughingstock. And we just had no clue if Metroid would ever come back to what it used to be, to what the fans loved. At that point, the last time we had actually had a real, new 2D Metroid game, which was obviously the roots of this series, was back in 2004, Metroid Zero Mission. And the last time we had a brand new 3D Metroid game that was in the style that everyone wanted, that was actually staying faithful to the core of the series, was Metroid Prime 3 Corruption in 2007. So technically, if you want to be very, very nitpicky about it, Metroid Prime Trilogy also came out in 2009, which was technically the last release of what people actually loved about the Metroid series. So let's just say that. 2004 was the last 2D, 2007 was the last brand new, but let's just go with 2009 for the sake of argument here. That was still over 7 years. 7 years of bad games, games that did not represent the franchise as a whole, and games that just slapped every single fan in the face and said, this is what you like, because this is what we make now. Now, this was around the time that obviously everything at Nintendo was going really, really poorly. 2016 was one of the worst years for Nintendo, considering the idea of the Wii U having been a failure, and then that was the last year of its existence before the NX, and then the Switch ended up coming out in 2017. They really had to relaunch. They had just lost Iwata, the president, a year prior to that in 2015, so it was a very, very rough time for them. They had just really lost sight of what made them popular to begin with, of what made people love their series in the first place. And that would all change in 2017 with the Nintendo Switch, and little did we know that 2017 would bring an unexpected Metroid game that didn't even get announced in an actual presentation, but got announced after the big E3 presentation in 2017, Metroid Samus Returns. This was a complete remake of the second Metroid game, Metroid II: Return of Samus. They put it on the 3DS, and if you remember from earlier when I was talking about Metroid just having an unfortunate trend of putting either great games or just like solid games on a console at the very end of its lifespan, this was another example of Metroid just being so far behind that no one wanted to buy it anymore, because in June of 2017, when it was announced, the Switch had already been out. It was the new hot thing, and they didn't even talk about the game in the E3 presentation because they wanted to completely focus on the Switch and Switch exclusive games. So then afterwards, they were like, oh, by the way, Metroid's coming. Metroid Samus Returns for the 3DS. And of course, at that point, everyone was on the Switch train. So this game really did not have a chance. It just didn't stand a chance. But once it actually released, it was critically acclaimed across the board. People loved this game. It introduced so many different mechanics to the 2D series and was the first game we had in 13 years in the 2D Metroid series. Not a new one, sure, but the first one since then. You cannot tell me that it didn't scratch that itch for so many people. And with all of the incredible quality of life features that they added, like the 360 free aiming, you could go anywhere you wanted as long as the stick let you do it. Like you could aim in whatever direction you wanted. There was a melee counter. They added ion abilities, which was so cool. You could have a scan pulse, a lightning armor, beam burst, phase drift. They added teleportation stations to make it faster to go from place to place. They expanded all of the level design. They reinvigorated the map from what it used to be and just made it better. The boss fights, the combat, the enemies, every single thing about it was just so much more fluid, and it felt like the potential for a real, made from the ground up, brand new Metroid game, hopefully on the Nintendo Switch, was real. It felt like we could actually get back to where we were supposed to be if we could improve upon Samus Returns and just make a brand new 2D Metroid game for the Nintendo Switch. Oh my goodness, the potential was there, and it excited so many people. The company behind this game was Mercury Steam, and we all believed at the time if they were just given the reins, if they were given an idea, a new game to work with, they would make one that absolutely made our jaws drop. Now, it was also in 2017 that Metroid Prime 4 was announced in that E3 presentation covering every single exclusive Switch game, and man, oh man, did we not realize how long we would have to wait for that game, but there was still hope. Metroid Samus Returns, finally, a new 2D Metroid game. Metroid Prime 4, a brand new 3D Metroid game. The series was back. Nintendo was back. Well, then we went a long time and did not hear any news whatsoever about any of these new Metroid games, a potential 2D one, or any sort of update from the Metroid Prime 4 announcement that they had in 2017. And every other game in that E3 presentation either released that year or released in 2018 like they had promised and like they had set those expectations for. Now, Metroid Prime 4 was the only game in that series of announcements in which they said it's just in development. They didn't give us a date, they didn't give us a time, they didn't say anything other than now in development. And whatever happened with it must have gone catastrophically wrong, because in 2019, they gave us an update. An update saying it was going to be delayed and handed back over to the studio that did the first 3 Metroid Prime games, Retro Studios. This was extremely depressing, but at least we were getting it at all. However, Retro Studios is another horror story coming out of Nintendo because it is the only Western studio that Nintendo actually owns, and they had a lot of miscommunications and canceled projects to where it just seemed like all of the crunch time through the Metroid Prime series and just every single thing coming out of that studio sounded abysmal. And the last new game that they had put out was actually Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze in 2014, and at the time of this recording in 2025, they still have not released a new game. They went 11 years basically without putting out anything. So at the time, especially in 2019, which at this point was 6 years ago when they announced this update, insane, they were still scared, were the fans, and we didn't know if that meant anything good or not, because Retro Studios had done perfectly with the first 3 games, but a lot of the staff that worked on those games had quit their jobs and left because of all of the insane difficulties the studio had gone through. Would Metroid Prime 4 be canceled? Would it ever come at all? Would we ever get a brand new 2D Metroid game? Well, it took a few more years, but it was worth the wait. In June 2024, at the last E3 presentation Nintendo would ever do, Nintendo announced Metroid Dread, Metroid 5, the final game in the installment and the storyline of the 2D Metroid series of old. This game was incredible, and the fact that it existed at all, that Nintendo greenlighted, that their developers were allowed to do this, shows how much they've changed since those Federation Force days, since the Other M days. They are letting their developers do what they believe is best and are greenlighting amazing projects. Mercury Steam was allowed to take this game over, and they did exactly what everyone had predicted when Samus Returns released. The game was fluid as ever. Samus has never felt better to control, arguably in any installment, 2D and 3D combined, and I am a big 3D platformer type of guy, but this game makes those games feel sluggish in comparison. You are almost gliding through levels once you get down of every single bit of her moveset. The grappling hook is back, the ion abilities are back, the beams, all of the different missiles, everything you could do in the older games and more is here in Metroid Dread, and they upped the ante by telling even more story in this game and adding more horror elements like they had been kind of hinting at towards the end of Metroid 3 and 4. They included the Emmy robots, which were terrifying, absolutely terrifying, and once you entered their territory and they found you, they would not stop chasing you until you either got away from them, left their territory, or went silent for a few seconds with that invincibility power. Metroid Dread was everything it needed to be. It wrapped up the story as well as you could possibly wrap up a story, and Samus was finally back for the first time in HD in the 2D series. It was well worth the wait. Although I wish we didn't have to wait as long as we did, I would still say it was well worth the wait. And kind of like I hinted at earlier, in 2023, just a couple years after Dread release, we got Metroid Prime Remastered, which did pretty much the entire first game, but better. All of the assets were redone, it was all spruced up for HD, and of course with the Nintendo Switch, you could play it anywhere at any time. Truly a treat for every Metroid fan. I am recording this video on February 16th, 2025, and we still don't have an official release date for Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, but in the recent financial report on February 4th, they did reconfirm Metroid Prime 4 Beyond is still releasing this year on the Nintendo Switch. Alongside Pokemon ZA, that game will 1000% be on the Switch, and very well might be some sort of cross-platform game with the Nintendo Switch too. Now, Metroid Dread sold 3 million units, and that ended up being, by far, the biggest and highest selling game ever in the franchise. Now, 3 million isn't a big number, but it is big in comparison to all of the awful flops that Metroid had before it. And it seems to be somewhat of a trend continuing, unfortunately, with Prime 4 releasing at the very end of the Switch's lifespan. If this game had come out closer to 2018, 19, even 2020, I am positive it would have sold like bananas. But now we can only hope to say it will end up being better than Dread. We could hopefully say it will be a better success. It's been hyped up for so long. It has been in the mainstream media for such a long time because of the delays, because of the fan base going stir crazy. So maybe all of that combined will allow Prime 4 to take the mantle from Dread and maybe even sell somewhere to 4, 5, even 6 million copies. From the one trailer that we have seen of this game, it looks gorgeous, and on the Switch 2, I'm sure it will look even better. If they actually time this release correctly, I truly do think that the appeal from the masses and just the type of hype they could stir up from this game could lead to the best-selling game in the Metroid series, maybe even by far. So now we have reached the end of our Metroid history lesson, and what is the state of the Metroid series? Well, Metroid has gone through a lot of ups and downs, especially considering the entire 2005 to 2017 drought. I mean, we got almost no games in terms of 2D, we got 2 Prime games in the trilogy, but still, it was rough for fans of the original series and the original games. Nintendo seemed to lose complete and total sight of what the series actually was. They did these weird spin-offs that they thought were going to be lucrative and ended up being the biggest flops they've ever had. It was looking dark. But now, in the Switch era, just like almost every other series in Nintendo's catalog, everything is looking on the up and up. With Metroid Dread, Metroid Prime Remastered, 4 Beyond, and a potential new 2D game on the Switch 2, I really do think the Metroid series could very well be back. Now, Metroid Prime 4 will absolutely release this year. I believe that for certain. There will be no more delays. It will probably also release before the Switch 2 comes out, if they're smart at least. So that means if my predictions of the Switch 2 coming out around June is correct, we should be getting this game relatively soon. And that tells me a lot about how they might end up spacing out some of these Metroid games moving forward. We probably won't get a 3D Metroid game again for a long time unless Prime 4 ends up being a massive success, in which case they would go back to the drawing board and create a new one as quickly as possible. But I do think it's incredibly likely that either this year or next year we see the first look at our brand new 2D Metroid game on the Nintendo Switch 2. I think Metroid is back in the limelight. They're going to try and make it more of a prominent series and bring it back while they're riding this momentum that Dread has. And Prime Remastered may have only sold 1.3 million copies, which is a pretty disappointing amount of sales for the game looking as gorgeous as it does. I think that might also have something to do with the fact that they kind of shadow dropped it, which can help some games, but also I think Metroid could use a little bit more of marketing hype. So we'll have to see looking forward what this series looks like, but right now, I wouldn't be surprised if they ended up making some sort of Metroid series or show, because Nintendo Pictures, baby, they've been at work for a while. What are they doing? I had predicted that they're making a Splatoon show, and I think that's incredibly likely, but just as likely is some sort of Metroid show. If they want to get people invested in these games, they now have the option to use other forms of media to get people to care about the franchise. They should absolutely take advantage of the hype that these Zelda movies are getting, that the Mario movies are getting, and continue to expand their IPs. That would be something of dreams, man. Like, can you imagine Samus on the big screen? Oh my goodness, it's just got me frothing at the mouth. So that was the state of the Metroid series. Make sure you like and subscribe today's video if you enjoyed the content. Click that notification bell so you don't miss any other videos just like this one. And if you want to join my membership program, you will get early access to all of my videos. So if you want to watch my very first state of video talking about the state of the Nintendo Switch Online, make sure you click on the left side of the screen, and if you want to see my other videos in this series, click on the right playlist. Thank you guys so much for making it to the very end of this video. This has been Ray's Nintendo Talk. I have been Ray, and I will see you all in the next video. Have a great day.